I think I said Esau. Jacob wrestling God, and all that, what all that represents, what all that meant. This first moment that the nation of God is called Israel, where the name of Israel comes from. This wrestling, and now we've moved into chapter 33 and 34, where Jacob actually goes to meet Esau. So remember, leading up to wrestling God, he is praying to God for help about Esau, because Esau is on his way to meet him and his family with 400 men, presumably to do some damage to get his vengeance. And so he's praying for help, and the way God helps him is he comes and wrestles him, he comes and injures him, he comes and hurts him, and they have this struggle, this wrestling that all of us do with God, metaphorically, that all of us are wrestlers in some sense. And so they have this wrestling, and then he goes to meet Esau in chapter 33, still afraid that it's going to be battle, but Esau runs up to him and embraces him, and we talked about last week, Greg asked last week the right question. Was Esau planning vengeance, and then all the gifts and forgiveness kind of showed up with Jacob's people that he had sent ahead, and he changed his mind? That seems likely, but it's hard to know for sure. But he shows up, and he's happy. He is excited to see him. He is welcoming him. He doesn't even want to take Jacob's gifts, but Jacob insists on the gifts. And there's kind of this reversal of the early Jacob and Esau relationship, where now Jacob is the giver instead of the taker, and Esau is speaking compassionately about his brother instead of with vengeance. And so we have that in chapter 33. Chapter 34, we have an interesting story. We have chapter 34 and 38 are kind of almost tangential to the main storyline, but they're important in the reference to the New Testament. The first part of chapter 34 is about one of Jacob's daughters named Dinah. Verse 1, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her, and he lay with her, and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." Okay, so Dinah, who is one of the daughters of Jacob, goes out into the city and is either sexually abused by this man or sleeps with this man consensually. It's kind of hard to tell with the language what exactly goes on. It seems probably the former, but we can't say for sure. Whatever it is, this man does what he shouldn't have done and sleeps with this woman or young woman. We don't know how old she was. Sleeps with this young woman who is not his wife. And now the brothers of her, Jacob's sons, are enraged at this. Okay, they are obviously very mad about the situation. And the man who did it, named Shechem, falls in love with Dinah, decides he wants Dinah as his wife. And so we have the Israelites, which just means Jacob's family, Jacob and his family in this new country of Shechem, this new city of Shechem. And this man, whose name's Shechem, is the prince of the land, and he wants one of the daughters of Jacob as his wife. And so there's this meeting between the king of the land, Shechem's father, and Jacob, and about trying to get Dinah's hand in marriage. And Jacob doesn't like the idea at first, but eventually they have this idea that they're going to kind of join together nations, which wouldn't have been good for the promise of Abraham's seed, because there would have been a mixture of nations, which God had commanded not to do. But what happened was Shechem and his father came into the home of Jacob and his brothers said, okay, here's how it's going to work. And they acted like they were making a deal, but actually they were planning their demise. They said, you can't be a part of us unless you are circumcised. Because of our covenant with God, if you're going to be a part of us, you must be circumcised. And so Shechem, really wanting to marry Dinah, said no problem. And him and his father and all the men of Shechem, all the men of the country, were circumcised that day so that he could then marry Dinah. But the plan actually was not to welcome them into the home. The plan was that when these men of the city were hurting in the days following from their circumcision, the brothers would attack. And that's what happened. In the third day, when it says when they were very sore, let's see, where is that? 25. Thanks, dude. On the third day, verse 25, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. And it goes on. So they kill all the men. They take all the women and children captive. They commit an atrocity in response to the atrocity committed against their sister. Jacob is upset about this, of course, saying that they have ruined their relationship and their reputation in the area. And they say, are we to let them treat our daughter like a prostitute? And so they are forced out of the land. Okay, so they go to where Esau lives and live in the city nearby. And then all this happens with Dinah and Simeon and Levi. And then they're forced out of that city. Okay, so they're moving again. Okay, and then chapter 35 is just basically the conclusion of Jacob's story, where we have Jacob goes back to Bethel as he promised God that he would. He then experiences the death of his wife Rachel and birth of Benjamin, the final child, and then him and Esau go together as Isaac dies, and they have a funeral basically, and they bury him. Chapter 36 is just all about Esau's descendants. Esau's descendants will play a role in the rest of the Bible, really, called the Edomites, especially in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament, all the kings named Herod are Edomites. They're from Esau. So they come from this line, and this is giving us that line, chapter 36. Then chapter 37, we get the new main character. Okay, so we've moved from Genesis 1 through 11, which is this sort of special kind of history with the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Now we've moved through the main characters of the rest of the Genesis. And the main story, again, of Genesis is the promise of God. The main story is not about really the people. It's about the promise of God that continues with Abraham, and then with Isaac, and then with Jacob, and now the focus is on Joseph. In chapter 37, we are introduced in some real sense to Joseph. Okay. We meet Joseph. He's about 17 years old, so not a young child by any means. And very often we start a story with the idea that we have of this character from the end of the story. So when you think of Joseph, you think of the man who was ruler over Egypt and who ended up treating his brothers with compassion and forgiving them and welcoming them in and all that stuff. But he starts out as kind of a twerp. And I think maybe we missed that, but pay attention. Chapter 31, verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Okay, that's part one. The first introduction we get, and that's the whole story, by the way. There's not more to that story. It's just that Jacob tattletales. That's the whole story. That Jacob comes back to his father and says, Dad, so-and-so did this. That's how we begin the story of Jacob, this 17-year-old. He brings a bad report about the father. Verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph. Israel loved Joseph more than the other sons. That's going to go well, right? Just like that goes well in today's world. It went well then as well, of course, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. We all read about that in Bible school. But when his brothers saw their father loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him. Shock and awe. They hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, Joseph had a dream, verse 5. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. You remember the dreams? And we won't read them, but the dreams where all these things were bowing down to him, the 12 tribes bowing down to him, the father and mother bowing down to him. And he couldn't just keep those dreams to himself, right? He had to go tell them, right? He knew there was this sibling rivalry thing. He knew his brothers hated him because he was his dad's favorite and everybody knew it. And so he has these dreams about his brothers literally bowing down to him. And he can't keep his mouth shut. He can't wait. He can't wait to tell them. He tells them both dreams. Not one dream's not even enough. I had 2 dreams, and in both of them, you're bowing down to me. And not only you, but mom and dad themselves are bowing down to us. Verse 8, his brother said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And then he does it again. Verse 11, and his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Okay, so he has these dreams. He announces them to his brothers about how he indeed is the favorite, and he should be the favorite because how everyone's going to bow down to him and all those things. And this is the picture we get of Joseph going in. One more thing. Verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. We've heard that before, right? Joseph's going to... Why wasn't he out there with them? This dude's at least 17. Right? He's at least 17. He's in the strength of his years, and he's at home while all the brothers are out there working. It's the same story. We have soft Joseph, spoiled Joseph, spoiled Joseph. While all his brothers go out there and work, Joseph's just at home with old mom and dad, just chilling, even though he's a grown man, while the rest of them work. Another reason they loved him. And so, indeed, Joseph goes to them, and you remember the story. They end up being in Dothan, And so he heads towards Dothan, and the brothers conspire to kill him. They said, we'll kill him, we'll cover his robes in blood, and we'll tell our father that a wild animal got him. Then Reuben, the older brother, steps in and says, no, let's not do that. Let's not put a hand on him. Instead, let's just put him in this pit over here, basically while we figure out what to do. And his plan, it tells us, his plan was to save Joseph. He was going to save him and bring him back. Reuben had an honorable plan. But while he's in the pit, some Midianites ride by, see him in the pit, and grab him out, and they sell him into slavery in Egypt. So technically, it isn't actually the brothers who sell him. Technically, it's the Midianites who sell him into slavery. And then Reuben goes back to the pit to get his brother, and he's not there, and he freaks, of course, realizing that they've got a bit of a pickle on their hands. Now they got to tell their father something. Look down at verse, 29. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, returned to his brothers, and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it's your sons or not." Pause for a moment. Why did they do that? They didn't have to do that. Why didn't they just tell him the Midianites took him? That would have been a reasonable explanation. But it's not the one they chose. They could have said that he was kidnapped by the Midianites and he was sold into the Egyptians, and we couldn't get it. We couldn't get him. So it's interesting to ask why they didn't do that, why they went back to the original plan of he got killed by an animal, and they tell him this story. I don't know the answer to that. It could be because they were afraid they'd be seen as guilty in some way. They should have done more. Certainly it was because they knew Jacob would pick up and go. Right? They'd be chasing that Egyptian trail down, and they didn't want any part of that. Pick up all their lives for this brother they hated anyway. So they don't do that. They don't do the honorable thing. Right? So first they do the dishonorable thing. They don't welcome their brother, even though he's a twerp. They don't welcome him. They don't treat him well. They don't treat him like a brother. They throw him in the pit. And then, when they have the opportunity to repent and do the right thing, tell their father what happened, they don't. They lie. They make up a story to try to cover their own butts. So we see that as the beginning of the story of Joseph. And then verse 34, Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning," which is just him saying, I'm going to mourn until I die. I'm going to mourn to death. I'm going to mourn until I die. I will go down to the grave mourning. I cannot be comforted. Verse 36, meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Okay, so we have this narrative moving forward pretty quickly now where this beginning of Joseph's story has begun. Joseph, the kind of selfish, spoiled brat, which always happens when the kid is obviously the favorite. This is what occurs. Joseph is that guy, and his brothers hate him because of it, and he ends up being sold into slavery, and on his way to Egypt, he is being shackled in chains and being drugged, probably walked from there all the way to Egypt behind camels or horses or whatever it was, and sold into Potiphar's house. So a fair amount of time there passing in that final verse of that chapter. But we have again here in chapter 38 a bit of a tangential story, but one that's very significant, and we'll see why in a moment. Anything about those things so far? Basically just being kind of history today so far. Anything about those historical things so far? Doctor?
So, you said the Midianites pulled him out and took him?
Yeah.
I thought the brothers sold him.
Well,
The Midianites/Ishmaelites.
yeah, it doesn't appear that way, and that it could be that it is true. But let's see. Look down at okay. So verse 27. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. Brothers, listen to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Right. So you have the Midianites selling him to the Ishmaelites. So it seems to be a third party there, right?
So did the Midianite traders draw Joseph up and lift him out of the pit, or was it the brothers? Does they refer
The first
to
one.
the brothers or to the traders?
The first one. The Midianites pulled him up out of the pit. That's why when Reuben goes back to the pit, he's surprised. Right? He goes back to the pit and he's not there and he's surprised. Now, let me say this, okay? Because later in the story in Genesis 50, when Joseph's recounting it, he says, "You sold me into slavery." So there's a sense in which that, there's a sense in which that's true, that the brothers played a role in it. Go ahead.
NIV says his brothers pulled him out of the pit.
In the same verse?
In verse 28.
Interesting.
89 merchants came by. His brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern.
Okay, so that's
Is that a mistranslation?
Well, it's just the word they. It's just a pronoun. So they're trying to make it clear who it was. And it may have been, but the difficulty with that is that Reuben was surprised. And then he goes back to his brothers and says, he's not there. Right? So it could be that his brothers did it without Reuben and then surprised him. But you're making and I'm not saying it's incorrect, but they're making a leap when they're making a interpretational decision when they say his brothers drew him up. All it is a pronoun. All it is a Hebrew pronoun they. Basically, is the word they. Say again. Right, and that more willing to do that. Yes, go.
In Sunday school when they told
I know.
was out watching the sheep.
I know. That's editorializing, and it's possibly true, but it is editorializing. So it's okay. So there's parallel options there. It could be that the brothers behind Reuben's back did it, but normally the grammatical rule is the pronoun refers to the last proper noun, which is the Midianites. And it makes sense. So it could be either one. It doesn't matter. The story is the same in that it's very interesting for all of us because we all grew up watching the same little movies and stuff. And it's certainly possible that's the case, but it doesn't say that outright, at least here. It says
Technically, it was the brothers, because they're the ones that started the change.
they started it all, right. And so they were causative in some sense, but who exactly put their hands on him and who exactly did all those things is who knows a bit. Certainly, yep, no doubt. They certainly conspired to. When they said,
Amplified one says the brothers pulled him out too.
yeah, I'm missing it right now, but it says the verse that we could sell him for profit. It says the Midianites pulled him out. Yeah, so there you go. This is beautiful. This is. Yeah, Paul carried King James. That's right. This is a good example. This is a good example of this. One of the things I'll do every week in sermon prep. This is a good thing to do in studying the Bible. Is when you're reading a certain passage to read multiple versions because you're going to see if there's what's called textual variance or just kind of different interpretations of what a word means. There, the pronoun they could mean Midianites, but it should mean Midianites until it doesn't, just with the rules of the grammar. But it may not. It may mean the brothers. So it could be the one that pulled him out. The brothers didn't make money, so. Yeah, I think it's the Midianites. It could go either way. We reading back there? Yeah, that's good. This is good. This is good discussion. Here's something very interesting. You may hear this sometimes. Is that atheists will say something like, "There's 200,000 errors in the manuscripts of the New Testament or the manuscripts of the Bible. There's 200,000 errors. All of them are things like that, where there's differences in small interpretations that don't change the story at all. There's not one difference in variation in our early texts of Old Testament or New Testament, many more from New Testament, that changes actually substantially what the passage is saying, which is incredible. We have 30,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and not one of them says something that is significant theologically different than any of the other manuscripts. That's insane. We don't have any other text like that. So anyway.
Well, if you look at this very carefully, and I'm using the New King James Version, after it says that the Mennonite merchants came back, there's a comma, and then there's...
Yeah, there just weren't commas in Hebrew. In fact, even in Hebrew, there was no punctuation. There were no vowels. Very difficult. We have a very difficult time translating. Yeah.
I always told my students that translation is more of an art than science.
That's true. And we do our best. But it is, like there are words in the Old Testament that we're not sure if it means that word or that word because the different vowels would mean different words, but they didn't use vowels. So we don't know which word it is. We take educated guesses. Like there's things like that where you're translating from one language to another and it's just not one-to-one. So there's some wiggle room there. Lou?
Well, I'm changing the subject, but.
That's fine.
Like Reuben and Judah, I mentioned they're the two that didn't they get larger portions of land? And then the lineage of Jesus started through the line of Judah?
That's right. Yeah, and there's more. There's probably more to it also, or more to the story of them kind of being more significant. They're the ones that stand up at the end of the story as well, that are loudest with their father offering themselves for the sake of Benjamin, and Reuben's the oldest, which is another thing. Anyway, it's often Reuben and Judah are portrayed as the oldest because Simeon and Levi did the murder thing, and so they were like taken out of the order and weren't given, so they're given smaller things. and Reuben and Judah are given more. Joseph given his son, Ephraim given a lot too. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so who sold him? I don't know. All right. Whoever did.
We're just gonna figure it out if we get.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Midianites sold him to Potiphar. Yep. Okay. All right, yeah, anything else on that? That's good. That was fun. Anything else?
Thank you. To me, it's how incredibly cruel those boys were. Not just to Joseph, but to their dad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a great point. And that's a very significant thing to hold on to, because this story is in many ways about the repentance of the brothers, about the brothers in the end finally doing the right thing when they didn't have to. In the beginning, they certainly didn't. And that's such a good point. It's not just that they treated Joseph badly. They treated their father badly. Favorite son or not, son, pretending he's dead, causing their father to mourn until his death. Yeah, not great. Okay, chapter 38 is about Judah and Tamar. You've heard the story. Well, one of the great proofs of the reliability of the Bible is that its main characters have warts, and just a lot of them. Like if you were to make up a story, your main characters don't look like fools, like Peter does in the New Testament, which is the main character outside of Jesus in the New Testament, certainly until Paul. And in the Old Testament, you have all these men who are the 12 tribes of Israel, the fathers of the tribes, the one who and Judah here being the one from whom Christ comes. And yet, let's read, shall we? Verse 12. Look at verse 6 first. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. How about that? Then Judah said to Onan, father said to Onan, the other son, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. I'll make a cultural comment on that in a minute. Let's read again. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord. So God killed him, which he can do whenever he wants. Isn't that how fear of God thing? Real thing that we should have.
This is one of those stories we skip over in children's Bible.
Yeah, we don't do that one. Yeah, there's no coat of many colors in this story, and we're not done yet. Right? It doesn't get any better. So we have this. Okay, so let me say this. This was this brother going in for your deceased brother to the widow was a normal cultural thing. It's referred to now as the Levirate marriage or the Levi marriage, and it was considered the right thing to do because a woman without an heir, a woman without a son, was much less in the cultural totem pole, without children certainly, and then a woman without a son, and then that brother without a son would not have an heir, so that his line stops with him. And so that was the goal, was for the line not to stop. And so the brother would do his duty with the wife, with the widow, and give him an heir to continue his family line. Now here's what's interesting, right? Here's what's interesting. We think about that today in today's culture. We talk about all the time how our culture impacts us. In our culture, the offensive part of that, the part that bothers us, is him going into his dead brother's wife, right? Is the sexual part. That's what bothers us primarily. That wasn't a big deal for them. For them, the big deal was, the reason he didn't want to give him offspring is because he would be financially responsible for that offspring. That was also part of it. That he would be responsible for caring now for Tamar and Tamar's child. And also that it would give his brother an heir, and he had that up on him now. So he has this very, very... With us today, we'd be like, of course I'll take care of her financially. Right? Of course I'll care for her. Of course I'll do that. That's like for us, yeah, of course I'll do that. But the other part, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. But for them, it was the opposite. So there's a lot of things that we take kind of just for granted culturally. The one we talk about most often is our modern American people have a very big problem with hell, when no one else has had a problem with hell almost ever in history. That's kind of new to us. And so there's these kind of novel, even today in the Middle East, if you go to the Middle East and preach the gospel, they're offended by the idea of forgiving someone who doesn't deserve it. That's what they're offended by. And over here, we love that idea. We don't like the idea of people getting what they deserve, or hell, whatever you want to call it. We don't like that idea. So cultures, this is why you must be connected to the rock of the Word, and the rock of God, the rock of Christ that's not movable by culture. That's always the same. And we see a little bit of that here. This culture to us doesn't make a lot of sense, right? I'll give her much money she wants. I ain't doing that, right? And they kind of saw that as reversed, which is interesting. Okay, so Tamar is not given an heir. Both the sons now dead. Judah has one more son, and he said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, verse 11, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers." So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. So Tamar didn't have to do that, decided to faithfully wait for the younger brother. She thought it was finally her time to be married, to have an heir. Now she's got to wait again. So she waits. Verse 12, now the fun part. "In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, when he'd finished mourning, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite." Verse 13, "And when Tamar was told, 'Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep,' she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage." Okay, so Judah has a young son. We now have had 10, maybe more years passed. She has not been given the husband, the third son. Judah never intended, apparently, to actually fulfill that vow, based on what he said earlier. Now she realizes that she has no hope of having an heir. And so she kind of takes matters in her own hands. Verse 15, "When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, 'Come, let me come in to you,' for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, 'What will you give me that you may come in to me?' He answered, 'I will send you a young goat from the flock.' And she said, 'If you give me a pledge until you send it.' He said, 'What pledge shall I give you?' She replied, 'Your signet and your cord and your staff that's in your hand.' So he gave them to her, and he went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he didn't find her. And he asked the men in the place, 'Where's the cult prostitute?' And they said, 'No cult prostitute's been here.' So he returned to Judah and said, 'I haven't found her.' And the men said, 'There hasn't been a prostitute here.' And Judah replied, 'Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her.' About 3 months, verse 24, later, Judah was told, 'Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality.' And Judah said, 'Bring her out and let her be burned.' Verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, 'By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant.' And she said, 'Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff.' And then Judah identified them and said, 'She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again.'" That's like a movie moment, right? That's like a movie moment. He opens it and he sees his signet, and his eyes light up, and he realizes what he has done. He realizes what has occurred. Not a Hallmark movie. That's right, Mimi. Thank you. Not a Hallmark movie. Verse 27. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied scarlet thread in his hand, saying, "This one came out first." And his name was Perez. Okay, so again, if you're starting in Genesis and you don't know about the New Testament yet, and you get to this chapter, you think, why in the world is this chapter in there? I'm learning about Joseph. We just started the story. Right, we've just gotten to Joseph, who, by the way, I think is probably the best picture of Jesus we get in the whole Old Testament. We'll get to that. I think he foreshadows Christ probably more than anybody else in the Old Testament. We'll look at that at the end. But we just started this great story of Joseph. He's been sold. He's been sold by his brothers. He's in Egypt, and he's in Potiphar's house, and then there's just this break. And Tamar and Judah and this weird thing, family stuff, and like tons of things happened in their lives. They lived 100 years or more. They did all kind of stuff. Why is this story in there? Well, a lot of you know, right? Go to Matthew chapter 1. Very first book of the Bible. This is how it opens. The 400 years of silence. God again speaks. Matthew chapter 1, verse 2. after verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar.